All right, the title really quick. The Night of Faith and Solitude, Thomas Merton's reading of Kierkegaard's Fear and Trembling. And I begin with a quote from Thomas Merton. This is when he was on retreat, and he was reading some Kierkegaard. Quote, read a little Kierkegaard's journal, but the reading was spoiled by the fact that the more intense passages ring in my ears the urgent and shouting tones of the retreat master. How, oh God, rings in his throat, coming right up from his belly. This has happened before in retreats, and that is why I prefer to read natural things when on retreat. Merton was first introduced to Fear and Trembling in 1940. In Merton's journal entry of November 26, 1940, he states that a week ago, I bought Kierkegaard's Fear and Trembling at Oxford University Press, and have since talked about it so much I feel as if I had been reading Kierkegaard all my life, end quote. While Merton could make that claim about any number of works, this text at this moment stands out among those that Merton took seriously. This new Catholic struggling to understand what it means to be Catholic turns to a heterodox Lutheran philosopher amidst his reading of Solitude, St. John of the Cross, St. Francis, St. Teresa of Avila, St. Augustine, St. Thomas Aquinas, etc. This text served as part of the education Merton assigned to himself between his baptism and entering Gethsemane. The text became one more confirmation of the religious turn that Merton had taken. And as a story of spiritual growth, Kierkegaard offers a map of the path Merton found himself on. Learning to walk alone. Fear and Trembling is a study on one stage of Kierkegaard's vision of the progress of the human being. Kierkegaard believed that we all generally begin at a self-interested stage, the aesthetic stage, that allows one to explore their passions without concern for its effects on the world. However, we eventually mature into the ethical stage, which is characterized by social conformity, in which the social and universal values take priority over the individual values of the aesthetic stage. However, this stage requires that we forgo our own freedom, and we are prevented from taking the leap which true religion requires. This final leap, illustrated by Abraham's sacrifice of Isaac, is a place of bare freedom before the face of God, giving up all reliance on a socially established self with commitment to universal ethics. For Kierkegaard, his betrothal to Regina Olsen represented all that was good in the ethical stage of life. And Kierkegaard feared that unlike Abraham, who could remain a father and spouse upon his return from Mount Moriah, he would be broken in a way that would no longer allow for the joy of a married and worldly life. Kierkegaard stood at a place of indecision for some time. His vacillation was unlike the firm determination of Abraham, but his ambiguous mind reflected the paradox of Christianity. Merton considers Kierkegaard's decision during a retreat in 1959. Happened upon Kierkegaard's analysis of why he had to reject Regina Olsen. All right, he had to, but it was sickness. It shocked me terribly. I wish he had not been so damnably honest in his self-examination. If he was less honest to take her, I wish to God he had deceived her and made her happy by his decision, even if it would have been lost in all his writings. Claire Carlyle, in her recent biography of Kierkegaard, discovered a source of his indecisiveness. She states, quote, while Kierkegaard found in Plato's philosophy a polemic against the world, the Christian scriptures taught him that divine truth could be embodied within the world, in a human body. According to the New Testament, Jesus was Christ, the Son of God, who revealed the deep, mysterious power of his Father by inhabiting finitude, living in the world, end quote. Kierkegaard felt trapped, quote, between monastic solitude and the chatter of academic debates and literary salons, end quote. Whether or not this dilemma was false, Kierkegaard's discomfort with the thought of married life and believed committing to the relationship with Regina Olsen would result in both Kierkegaard's and Olsen's unhappiness and disappointment. So Like the Buddha, walking away from spouse, child, and father, Kierkegaard believed his path could only be found alone. The question must always remain whether Siddhartha, St. Francis, Kierkegaard, Abraham, Augustine, Nachiketa of the Katha Upanishad were selfish, deluded, or monstrous. In Christ, we find that they had to mourn their own deaths. For Abraham, we find a truth that we can only know if we too sacrifice all. And like the rich young man of the Gospels, we shrink from nakedness necessary to enter the ranks of the knight of faith, the one who has taken the leap of the religious stage. While accepting what is necessary for the night of resignation, we must walk upon the abyss. Know that should we doubt, we will sink as Peter did before being pulled back and saved from our faithlessness. Thomas Merton knew that religious life always posed a danger, illustrated by St. Peter, to enter momentarily into true freedom, only to fall back into inauthenticity. The journal of the early years of World War II illustrates Merton testing the waters of his authentic nature and finding his true self, filled with pages devoted to saints who had lived the trial of fire and darkness. Merton's faith in the saints grew, which would permit him to grow in his own freedom. He was not yet ready to live his lonely freedom, as the solitary life had yet to become a live option. However, his personal course in the writings of the contemplative saints allowed him to believe that freedom was possible, whether in solitude or some other path. Kierkegaard, too, knew that freedom was possible, and this troubled Lutheran saint carried Merton on a tour of what might be necessary for the true joy that is found only through darkness. In Merton's tour of moving from death to life, Kierkegaard served as his Virgil. Fear and Trembling, Finding the True Self. And this is a quote from Kierkegaard. Quote, not only in the commercial world, but in the realm of ideas as well, our age is holding a veritable clearance sale. Everything is had so dirt cheap that it is doubtful whether in the end anyone will bid. Kierkegaard spent his short but prolific career fighting the Hegelianism that inhabited both philosophical and theological circles in Denmark and Germany during the 19th century. His critique was a diagnosis of larger ills that he found plagued the entire Christian world, becoming shallow in what he called Christendom. Merton found the world of the 20th century to also be sick, cheap, and noisy, and the need for silence stands as an impossible but necessary option. Quote, this vow of silence idea of Kierkegaard's is something you keep coming across everywhere, because radios are forcing men into the desert. The world is full of the terrible and howling engines of destruction, and I think those who preserve their sanity and do not go mad or become beasts will become Trappists, but not joining an order, Trappists in secret and in private, Trappists so secret that no one will suspect they have taken a vow of silence. Kierkegaard's teaching teaches that the objective existence is the source of our sickness. Being defined by the external life and the superficial reality created for us, we deny what is most important. Thomas Merton read Kierkegaard at a time when he was moving away from a largely external reality, finding his nominal left-wing politics and socially active life at Cambridge and early Columbia to be both exhausting and without meaning. Listening to the inward truth that pulled him to the point of overwhelming pressure, he could no longer set aside what spoke to him alone. Merton's conversion rings of an Augustinian subjectivity, but it is also a fully modern response. That is a timeless one. While Merton speaks to us in the world, in the church, in history, in human social life, in nature, etc., God also speaks to me and to you and to each of us, but he does so in a way that the encounter and the union is solitary. Kierkegaard's insight for the modern world of thought, then, is that while there is such thing as objective and universal truths, think Kant or Hegel, these do not define us in our singularity. While Merton was learning what it meant to be a Catholic and a Christian, a member of the church and a part of an institution, he was also teaching himself through contemplatives, theologians, and philosophers the importance of direct union with God. At this nascent point in his Christian development, concern was already advancing, and Kierkegaard was a key, albeit quieter, member of Merton's faculty of spiritual development. While living a life of the true self is an affirmation of the life given to and desired of us by God, that is not meant to be over and against others who also have such a life. Rather, the greatest way to be oneself is to be oneself without having to assert oneself in a violent, forced, and therefore artificial way. Merton affirms Kierkegaard's, quote, notion that the greatest saint probably looks like the stupidest bourgeois. The or a reason for this is that one must face and accept God in secret. The person of faith is a person alone, and when she is amongst others, she is most alone. Merton highlights Kierkegaard's, quote, notion of a vow of silence necessarily imposed upon a man capable of the kind of faith shown by Abraham in the trial over Isaac, end quote. While the hero stands out as the example for societal admiration and often envy, the knight of faith is rarely recognized. Kierkegaard finds the hero, the one respected and glorified by others, within the universal world, the world not of God so much as the world of temporal anxiety and its accompanying conformity to the given values of a safe place for human dwelling. The hero is known and understandable, something to strive for, while the knight of faith is incomprehensible, beyond ethics, beyond the universal, beyond the intelligible. This incomprehensibility arises in part because only that which is shared, that which is common in the common language, can be comprehended. The uncanniness of Abraham rather represents the, quote, individual presence of the absolute personality. And that's Merton. Merton calls Abraham both, quote, incomprehensible and absurd, end quote, because he leaves the seeker drawn and repelled in an uncanny desire that can only be fulfilled by the leap Abraham took. Imagine Abraham asking for counsel from another, and one may rightly charge him with a certain type of irresponsibility for failing to do so. You would find that he is not the father of faith. Faith requires one forgo that counsel. And here we walk in fear and trembling. He climbed Moriah alone, even though accompanied by his greatest worldly love, an object of his horrific deed. God is not a blanket of security, but an ocean of terrible love that can only be united with upon complete surrender. Out of love, Abraham speaks not to Sarah or Isaac. He does not speak to his servants. The Bible itself remains silent, keeping Abraham's secret by recording only the actions of Abraham. Kierkegaard spends the first several pages of Fear and Trembling displaying the absurd attempts to explain the affective experience of Abraham during and after his journey. This seemingly futile exercise will finally leave the speculative mind saying, surely no one was as great as Abraham, who is able to understand him, end quote. And I'm going to actually read the passage from Genesis, so we've all got that in mind. So this is Genesis 22, verse 1 through 3. God said to Abraham, Abraham, and he said, here I am. God said, take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains that I shall show you. So Abraham rose early in the morning, saddled his donkey, and took 2 of his young men with him and his son Isaac. He cut the wood for the burnt offering, and he set out and went to the place in the distance that God had shown him. This analysis of Abraham through the lens of Kierkegaard offered Merton a way to understand Mary, the mother of Jesus. Since neither Mary nor Joseph could understand what was being asked of Mary, her ascent is, quote, dreadful and magnificent and terrifying, and is not of the temporal world. Like the sacrifice of Isaac, Merton observed that the Annunciation has absolutely, quote, absolutely nothing theatrical about it. Merton's loneliness cuts her from those closest to her, but in this, Mary was the first to learn the lesson of Christ. Mary does not share her burden and affirms her freedom uncoerced. This loneliness is only possible in the silent depths of one's heart. Given the responsibility, silence, and secrecy, few follow this path set before Abraham and Mary. Perhaps all are offered it, but since it is told in silence, we do not hear or accept it. For Merton, this particular path of silence, quote, is not for most people, nor to be sought after, end quote. As he discovered in Mary, Merton saw in St. Francis one who did accept his trial, not during the happy days of moving about with fiddle in hand and birds all around, but after the terrifying union with Christ and Christ sharing his wounds with Francis. Therefore, seeking to be like Francis alone in the presence of the Son is not to be idly asked by a terrible crowd afraid of a toothache. Abraham, Mary, and Francis accepted burdens and gifts with a freedom few can imagine. However, what the imagination cannot provide, God may offer when we are ready to accept our freedom. Until then, we live in Augustine's not yet. Lilies and birds, quieting the noise. During a trip to Boston, the same trip that Merton spent reading Fear and Trembling, so this is in 1940, Merton also went to the Boston Public Library, where he read an essay by Kierkegaard, a reflection on Christ's instruction to Matthew to be like the lilies of the field and birds of the air. Kierkegaard recruits the lily and the bird as teachers of silence and expectant waiting for God. He says, "From the lily and the bird as teachers, let us learn silence, learn to keep silent. For surely speech places the human being above the animal, and if you like, far above the lily. But because the ability to speak is an advantage, it does not follow that there is no art in the ability to keep silent, or that it would be an inferior art. On the contrary, precisely because a human being has the ability to speak, for this very reason, the ability to keep silent is an art. And precisely because of this advantage of his tempts him so easily, the ability to keep silent is a great art. But this he can learn from the silent teachers, the lily and the bird. The lily and the bird do not seek to be heard above the noise, nor are they affected by it. They can instruct in their own silent way how to approach God. For Kierkegaard, then, the Gospels are a school in drawing the seeker closer and closer to what is necessary to have this encounter. He says, quote, "One can paraphrase the Gospel's words as follows. You shall begin by prayer, not as though, as we have of course shown, prayer always begins with silence, but because when prayer has properly become prayer, it has become silence. Seek first God's kingdom, that is, pray." Teachers of authenticity, Kierkegaard and Merton, work most thoroughly against deception and falsehood. Lying to others and to oneself amount to the same thing. When God speaks to our inmost selves, we have the opportunity to assent to God's will. If we lie to ourselves, we are normally saying no to God's will. In fact, when we speak, outwardly or inwardly, we cannot hear God, and we burn our energy before we can be united. Instead of the silence of the cross, we shout with the crowd to crucify Christ. Conclusion, silence and loving creation. Even if Merton knew, like Kierkegaard, that to seek silence in prayer was to seek God, he also knew that the second commandment, to love your neighbor as yourself, and Christ's other injunction, to love your enemies. This required Merton to break his silence and engage in the written word. The action of the word grew louder simultaneously with Merton's need for solitude and silence. And so in the midst of his action via the written word, which sometimes required the turning over of tables, Merton needed the lily of the field and the bird of the air more and more. Silence amidst the noise of the world becomes like a full, authentic, contemplative existence and action. Kierkegaard says that, quote, the ability to keep silent is something that you can learn out there in the company of the lily and the bird, where there is silence and also something of divinity in that silence. There is silence out there, and not only when everything keeps silent in the silence of the night, but also when 1,000 strings in motion all day long, and everything is a sea of sound, as it were. Merton addresses the tension between the objective realm of Christianity and society and the singular silent realm of contemplative union with God in No Man is an Island, his sequel to his contemplative masterpiece, New Seeds of Contemplation. The paradox of both the radical singularity of our relationship with God and the shared salvific path concerns Merton throughout his writings. Kierkegaard is a figure on one end of this, ensuring that we do not let go of that horn. Merton was keenly aware, as his faith grew through the years of World War II and into the 1960s, that the other horn could not be ignored either. Merton returns to Soren Kierkegaard during his retreat in 1959. While the early reading focused on silence and secrecy, Merton here finds Kierkegaard to equally be of help in how to live within the world. Merton quotes Kierkegaard as saying, quote, Christianity is not indifferent to anything secular. On the contrary, it is solely spiritually concerned for everything. Here, Merton recognizes that the line between the secular and the holy is one of the world, not one of religion. Such a lesson is clear enough in the Gospels, from the first expression of the incarnation and the humility of Jesus, not announcing himself in a loud and extravagant fashion, but being one among many, silent in the crowd. Merton finds that, quote, the true hiddenness of Christ was his ordinariness, end quote. Here, Merton finds in Kierkegaard the command of spiritual engagement with the world. It is the entire creation that is God's concern. And so it is, or ought to be, with us. Merton paraphrases Kierkegaard. The main idea from this retreat is one from Kierkegaard, that the man who is constantly seeking an objective worthy of love, an object worthy of love, and constantly rejecting every object because he still wants to find one that is really worthy, is perhaps in the end only pretending to seek and pretending only in order to dissimulate his own complete lack of love. For if one has love in him, he will soon find an object worthy of love and will be able to love everyone and everything, end quote. On the other hand, one must remember where we started, Kierkegaard's dissatisfaction with the Christianity of his day. Well, this means we must seek refuge. We're also called back into the world, into the church, and onto the streets. Merton employs Camus as a counter to the totalitarianism, which is the true source of the absurd, finding Kierkegaard's revolt against ethical Christianity or Christendom as to display the revolt of the authentic revolutionary advocated by Camus. Merton says that, quote, Camus can be called a religious thinker insofar as he appeals to an obscure and ultimate faith, end quote, recognizing that Camus is religious, is a, quote, faith in man, that Camus' religion is a faith in man, a faith in revolt itself, and a faith in the value of an existential witness to say no to the absurd. End quote. Like the Night of Faith, this faith is ultimate because it is beyond all objectivity, authoritarianism, and totalitarian reduction of the human being to determine part in the machine of false truths. Kierkegaard and Camus insist that we repeat our revolt, knowing that we will lose ourselves again and again to our false selves, sinking like Peter. Camus refused to be an existentialist like other existentialists. Kierkegaard refused to be a Christian like other Christians. Merton found that he needed to not be a monk like other monks. And if one's chosen vocation does not open one to freedom, to encounter and become united with reality, it is part of what is holding one to the point of resignation without faith. This type of obedience, the type of obedience advocated by Kierkegaard and Camus, is a radically different kind, inexpressible but no less real. Merton remained obedient to his order, but at the same time sought the silence needed to be the unique being known only by God. In this way, he could also encourage a more authentic Christian faith for all Christians and a more authentic human existence for all humanity. And Camus claims, like Merton and Kierkegaard, that Christianity must not be the false Christendom that mimics Christianity by claiming to be the true adherents to the institutional church. Camus pleads with Christians, quote, "What the world expects of Christians is that Christians should speak out loud and clear, that they should voice with their condemnation in such a way that never a doubt, never the slightest doubt, could rise in the heart of the simplest man," end quote. Lukewarm Christianity that fails to stand for love with the oppressed and to act upon that stance risks the fate of giving up its, quote, virtue of revolt and indignation, end quote. In ensuring that, quote, Christians will live and Christianity will die, end quote. Kierkegaard and Merton also believed that without authentic witness and revolt, grounded in a faith of silence, one is doomed to languish in the miserable comfort of the false self.